Hi, I'm Kat Oriel with Forbes Newsroom. Today we have Ambassador Gordon Sondland, the former ambassador to the European Union under President Donald Trump. Thank you for joining us today to discuss your new book, The Envoy, Mastering the Art of Diplomacy with Trump and the World, which is set to be released on October 25th. So for our audience that might not be familiar with your story, tell me a bit about your background and what eventually led you to becoming the ambassador to the EU.
Hi, Kat. Thanks for having me on. Well, I grew up in Seattle, college dropout. My parents were survivors of the Holocaust and reunited after having been separated for 7 years due to the war, and ultimately wound up in Seattle, where I grew up in a lower middle class neighborhood and background. And I started in the real estate business, buying and selling apartment buildings and so on. I dropped out of school because it just couldn't keep my attention. And I was eventually fortunate to build a fairly good sized business that ultimately morphed into hotels and other commercial real estate. I've always wanted to be a US ambassador because everyone I have ever known that has done that job said it was the most interesting thing they've ever done in their life. And these are people who have done some pretty interesting things. So for them to say that got me even more intrigued about serving my country someday.
And what inspired you to write this book?
Well, the first reason I wanted to write it was a lot of the facts in it were in my memory. They weren't in a diary or in notes, and I wanted to get it down on paper. And as I started writing, I realized instead of publishing basically a vanity book for my friends and my family, there are some messages I could convey in the book. And so I decided to make it a real book with a real publisher and a real publicist, and that's why I'm on your show today. The big things that I advocate for in the book are a closer relationship with the EU so that we don't squander the leverage we have when we work together with no daylight between us on a specific policy. Together, we're almost an unstoppable bloc that worries the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians. They love to exploit any differences. And when we show them no differences, they get very, very worried, which is exactly the intended effect. The second thing I wanted to advocate for is the important role of political appointees as ambassadors. Political appointees can do things that no career ambassador could ever do. Happy to talk about that more. Mm-hmm. And the third thing I wanted to advocate for was to not have particularly my party, the Republican Party, drift into isolationism, because we already know what that creates after World War II. And those who read any history at all will realize it's not the right path to take.
So we're 2 weeks away from the midterm election, and your book is coming out right as that is about to happen. Is there a particular reason why you decided to put it out now?
No, there was no strategic reason at all. I started writing the book, as I said, sometime in mid to late 2020. And once I decided to have it published, Post Hill Press, an imprint of Simon & Schuster, put it on their normal schedule, and this is when it came out. This date was picked many, many, many months ago, over which I had no control.
Okay, got it. And so in your book, you describe working for Trump as thrilling as first, comparing it to an all-inclusive resort hotel that went down very quickly. What was the moment where things started to change for you?
Well, listen, when people describe President Trump and they say, I really like him, I like his policies, he's so tough, he's so passionate, but I wish he would do this or stop tweeting or not say such vulgar things or whatever people want him to change, I respond and say, President Trump, like many other human beings, is a package. You get all or nothing, and you're not going to change him. He's not going to stop doing the things he's been doing basically his entire life. So you can decide, it's a yes or a no. Are you in or are you out? And I was in. I was completely in, even with all of the foibles that everyone has already identified, and I don't need to go through them again, until January 6th. January 6th changed everything, and it changed everything for two reasons. Reason one is we are looked upon by the world as the best in handing the keys over to our successor when we transfer power. We don't do it with guns. We don't do it with coercion. And these things that we do symbolically, where one person goes to the White House and is greeted by the other person, and they smile and shake hands, even though they hate each other's guts, and they ride in the car together, talking pleasantries, even though they hate each other's guts, and they stand up on the podium, and one looks gazingly at the other while the other is giving their inaugural address, again, hating each other's guts. And then they leave a note in the drawer, in the Oval Office. And other than leaving the note in the drawer, which as I understand President Trump did for President Biden, he didn't participate in any of the other important rituals, which really sends a bad message to other fledgling democracies and autocracies that want to become democracies. Mm-hmm. The second thing is he could have done a lot more to immediately stop what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. And for those two things, it was a no for me after that. Until then, I was in.
Yeah, and I feel like January 6th are one of those days that you remember exactly where you were watching it unfold. Where were you when this was all happening?
I was, I believe, watching it on television.
Yeah.
Probably, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, the way most of us were, and I was appalled. Not that I haven't seen a riot before, and not that I haven't seen violence and guns drawn and so on. I mean, you can't not see that when you watch the news every day, but to think that this is taking place specifically for the reason to prevent a peaceful transition of power, I didn't think we were in the United States. I thought we were somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. And so you testified against former President Trump during his first impeachment trial and were let go from your role soon thereafter. So you described being all in his mission. What was it like to speak out against the president, knowing that your position and relationship with him might be jeopardized because of it?
Well, first of all, let me push back on you about something. I did not testify against President Trump, nor did I testify for President Trump. Mm-hmm. I was asked a very specific, narrow set of questions, which I answered truthfully to the best of my recollection. Some of those answers had absolutely no impact on the president. Some probably had the effect of helping him, and some probably had the effect of not helping him. But my goal, unlike many of the other witnesses who clearly had an agenda during their testimony, I had no agenda. I didn't want to testify. In fact, I wanted to get back to Brussels and get back to work.
Mm-hmm. So how did you feel when Trump was eventually acquitted by the Senate?
Again, if I didn't feel one way or the other about it. Obviously, I wanted to continue to work on our agenda. Had President Trump been removed from office at that time, it would have been very difficult. And frankly, based on what I knew, as more and more information came out with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, I thought that particular action that the Senate took was under the flimsiest of reasons. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I was happy that the process was over. He was duly acquitted according to our laws and according to the rules of the Senate. And I thought now we can go back and continue to advance the interests of the American people. Mm-hmm. Again, I did not go to testify against him or for him. I just went to tell the truth. That was it.
Makes sense. And so how do you feel nowadays, though, seeing GOP lawmakers continue to hammer President Biden and Hunter over these dealings in Ukraine?
Well, I think there's a bit of hypocrisy going on. I think that the Hunter Biden issues should get the same scrutiny that all of the Trump issues got. And if there's no there, then that's fine. But I think that there's been a full court press to run interference for the Biden family and the Biden administration. And I don't think that's the way we work here in the United States. Once even the New York Times admitted that the laptop itself was legitimate, genuine, it was not fake, it was not fake news, I think all of the resources of All of the law enforcement and investigatory agencies that were employed against President Trump should equally have been employed against Hunter Biden.
How do you feel America's standing has changed since Donald Trump left office?
I don't think America's standing has changed at all. I think that President Trump had his own style and his own way of communicating. I can tell you, notwithstanding what many foreign leaders said publicly, privately, I think some appreciated his candor. Some were actually off-put because he called them on some very, very difficult questions that they didn't want to answer, or actions that they didn't want to take that were not necessarily in their own interests, but were definitely in the interests of the United States. I have to compliment President Biden on finally rallying the EU and supporting Ukraine. It's a little bit late, but at least it's happening now. And I hope that he puts his foot on the gas and doesn't take his foot off the gas when it comes to supporting. I also hope at the same time that the very right-wing faction of my party, who tend to be more isolationist, would reconsider their position and understand what happens, pointing specifically to the end of World War II, when you are an isolationist. And I hope that that's not going to be the case here.
Could you elaborate more on how you view the current state of the EU given the war on Ukraine?
Well, I've never seen the EU more unified than they are today. I mean, that's one of the problems with the EU in dealing with them, is most decisions of great import require unanimous consent by all 27 member countries. And it's not a majority rule situation where you just have to drag 50+1 over the finish line. You have to get everyone on board. So everyone uses, just imagine, for example, our own Senate or our own Congress having to get unanimous approval to do anything important. Nothing would ever get done. So the fact that the EU is actually all in on Ukraine's support today, and I hope it continues tomorrow, is nothing less than a miracle.
And how do you feel about the NATO expansion?
In terms of admitting Ukraine?
Admitting Ukraine, yes.
Yeah. Oh, I'm a huge advocate of that. In fact, I wrote a piece where I advocated that Ukraine should immediately be admitted to the EU, even though they don't completely qualify on all of the technical requirements. And then those technical requirements should be laid out, and they should be given, say, an additional 5, 6, 7 years to comply, with a sunset provision that if they can't comply, then the EU reserves the right to remove them. But I think they should be brought in immediately to send a very strong message, not just to Russia, but to other autocracies, that they are firmly in the Western world, in the Western sphere, and that question is taken off the table.
Okay. And so you've praised President Biden for his handling of the war in Ukraine and the aid that he's provided. How do you feel about President Biden's other actions in terms of foreign policy? Well,
it's been a very, very mixed record. On Afghanistan, that was a disaster. President Trump had a conditions-based withdrawal that was proceeding according to our schedule and our timetable. And I thought the precipitous sort of acceleration of that withdrawal was purely for President Biden's political purposes and did not serve our country well and sent all of the wrong signals. And those signals were received loud and clear in Moscow. And I believe that played a part in the invasion that just took place.
Getting back to your former boss, pertaining to President Trump's second impeachment, was that impeachment more or less disturbing to you than the first?
Definitely more disturbing. The first impeachment, as I said, I thought was done under the flimsiest of reasons. It wasn't done properly or democratically. And I thought that the outcome was designed to be pre-baked. I thought the second one had much greater gravity.
Mm-hmm. And looking towards the future, would you support the former president if he were to run again in 2024?
I would not, solely because of the January 6th situation. Up until then, I definitely would have supported him. Now my feeling is his policies were working. At the end of 2019, before the election, and certainly before COVID, to be fair, the country generally was headed in the right direction on any metric you wanted to look at, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And that direction has been precipitously and unfortunately reversed by President Biden. So the policies that President Trump had, I thought many of them were sound. And I think there are some excellent candidates that have already expressed an interest in running, or clearly, if they haven't expressed an interest, they clearly will run. And those include Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador Haley, Governor DeSantis, Governor Youngkin, and others. And I think any of those candidates and others are far better equipped to take the Trump policies and move the Trump agenda forward than President Trump would be, given all of the things that have transpired.
Which policies specifically?
You can start at the very beginning: secure borders, building up our military, making sure that China doesn't continue to steal our intellectual property, improving minority education and minority college attendance. I mean, every single metric, from social issues to military issues to economic issues, the trade deals that were underway, all of them were working. Some better than others, but most of them were working. And all of the needles, to use a bad analogy, were in the green arc when we were finishing the end of 19, and they're not today.
And so what has your life been like since leaving your role as the EU ambassador? What have you been up to besides writing the book?
Well, besides writing the Envoy, which comes out on October 25th, little plug there, I've been doing some speaking and, of course, running my business. I'm the chairman of a fund that owns hotels and shopping centers and office buildings and apartments. We have presence in many states around the country, and we have an incredible team. And I've been, working on the COVID-related problems, particularly in our hospitality sector, and so on. But now I want to lend a voice to bring my party back to reason. I want to see a good candidate elected in 24 to be our president. And as I mentioned, there are several in the field right now that I think are excellent and would be well qualified. And so that's what I'm doing.
Any plans to return to the Foreign Service?
I would love to serve again under the right conditions. I don't have to, but my learning curve is now quite well developed. So I feel like I could be additive for the right president and in the right place.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.